Well, thank you so much for that introduction and for framing the event today. Really looking forward to spending this time with you all and providing you some information about what we think is a really exciting initiative that I have the honor and the privilege to lead. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen there now and load up this slide deck. And Megan, I can still see you, so I'm just going to look to you for a nod to make sure that everything's visible. My audio is great, perfect, wonderful. And normally when I give this presentation or a version of this presentation, I do it in an hour slot. So we've got 90 minutes together today. Very often we're pressed at the end for time for questions. So I'm really looking forward to having a robust Q&A session with you all. So I'm sure we'll have lots of time to address the questions that you might have. And I do often get a lot of questions about this project. It's, I think, a really exciting, in some ways complex initiative. So I'm going to get into some detail there now. So welcome. Again, my name is Victoria Smith, and I'm the Policy, Privacy, and Sensitive Data Coordinator at the Alliance. And I'm here today to talk to you about an initiative that we're calling the Sensitive Data Repository Project. So what exactly is the problem that we're looking to solve? The issue is that there are very valuable, highly reusable research data that are destroyed only because they're sensitive. So more and more, of course, in an open data context and with good RDM practices, we're seeing researchers preserve their data, put them in repositories, and make them available in the long term for reuse. But we're seeing this practice largely in the context of data that, of course, isn't sensitive. So there's really a gap that we're seeing with regard to how researchers are able to implement best practices for research data, where sensitive data are just sort of prohibited or not really considered eligible for some of the RDM best practices that are emerging and being established as the norm. So again, simply because these data are sensitive, they might otherwise be excellent candidates for deposit and for reuse by other researchers. It might have cost a lot of money to collect these data. It might have been really complex to collect these data. You might have exposed research participants to a certain level of risk, whereby, that sort of invests the data themselves with that level of value. You don't want to have to repeat that sort of data collection. But because the data are sensitive, they're typically destroyed. But that best practice is changing. So we're seeing now in publishers and research funders and other organizations that have policies that determine how data are managed, that they're requiring data deposit or data sharing. So for example, CIHR published a policy in 2008 that required that data availability statements be included with research that was CIHR supported. But some research studies that were conducted then on CIHR recipients and the projects that those funds supported found that I think in over 90% of cases, even though there was a data availability statement included in the publication, ultimately there was no means to actually obtain those data. So when someone went looking for them, they found out, well, I've got the data, but I don't think I can share them with you. And I asked some folks in my institution and they said I can't, or yeah, that was a few years ago, I've since destroyed the data. Or yeah, I think I've got them here somewhere, I can't seem to find them. And some of the issues that contribute to this problem have to do with sort of the previous best practices associated with managing sensitive data. So often your ethics board, for example, might require that you store your data in an environment that's not connected to the internet. So a very easy way to do that, of course, is to use a flash drive. Now, flash drives are really easy to lose. So, how much sensitive data has been stored on a flash drive that's since been lost to the back of a drawer or fell out of someone's, book bag and so on. And that might sound silly, but it really is a genuine issue as far as managing sensitive data are concerned. So a best practice that starts out looking to increase the security of those data, that is, store them in an environment where they're not vulnerable to, to the internet, actually results in lowered data security because, of course, a lost flash drive can be accessed by anyone, and certainly eliminates the possibility of successful data reuse and preservation down the road if that flash drive isn't stored properly. So we're seeing these best practices change. We're recognizing that the previous paradigm where sensitive data were always destroyed is inefficient in a lot of ways. It doesn't allow for a recognition of the value of the data, the cost associated with collecting the data, the risk that participants might undergo in order to supply the data, and so on. None of that factors into what ultimately ends up happening to the data, which is they're all destroyed or sort of lost, to time, to flash drives and so on. But thankfully, we're seeing that change. We're seeing publishers and research funders and other organizations that set policy mandates require that data be deposited or data be shared. But researchers are really struggling to enable those best practices, to actually enact and practice those best practices. And their institutions are not being supported with the tools, the resources, the guidance, the supports that they would need to do that. And so that's really the rub here, is we're seeing this new best practice around data deposit and data sharing emerge that is long-term stewardship of data, not treating them like single-use plastics, but recognizing the potential longevity, the potential reusability, the significance of that data as an asset, but we lack in infrastructure, guidance, resources, and the other supports necessary to enable researchers and their institutions to enact these practices. So enter this project. So it's an ambitious project. So as you might think, well, that's a pretty, those are some pretty high level problems. So, you must be pretty ambitious if you think you can correct that. And certainly we are very ambitious, but we're humble and we're taking this project step by step. So we're not looking to set out overnight and transform how data are managed altogether in Canada. That would be a bit of a pipe dream. But certainly we think that we can make meaningful headway to begin to address these barriers and to begin to equip researchers and their institutions with tools and supports that will allow them to practice these sort of, these new ideals and meet these new requirements from publishers and funders and others. So the Sensitive Data Repository Project is a FRDR-led initiative. So FRDR, if you're not familiar, is the Federated Research Data Repository. So this is an open data repository that we at the Alliance operate. So hopefully you're familiar with what we do at FRDR. We're purpose-built to support very large data sets. So you might have a variety of repository options available to you, but if your data are very large, you might have been rejected by some repositories that said, wow, your data sound really cool, but unfortunately, we're not able to support, data sets of that size. Enter FRDR. So we're excellent at handling very large data sets. But we're also looking to, support the data repository ecosystem more broadly. We work closely, with Borealis and other groups. And this is another area where we're looking to help support the ecosystem. So it's a FRDR-led initiative, but it's not just about FRDR. So we've got two goals here. One is about our repository. It's about using FRDR as a pilot opportunity. We want to augment the capabilities of our repository to allow for the secure and controlled deposit and sharing of sensitive research data. But we're doing that really to support institutions and other repositories with sensitive data sharing and management. So we're going to be testing out tools, workflows, practices, policy frameworks, and all kinds of other things that I'll be getting into in a few minutes within FRDR, but supporting the adoption and the adaptation of those tools and resources and workflows and so on by other repositories, by other organizations that are data stewards, and certainly by research institutions and researchers themselves. So it really is a collaborative initiative. We want to sort of take on the bulk of the work, do the, put in the elbow grease, supply the resources, supply a lot of the technical infrastructure that's needed to support this work, and create a forum or an environment for collaboration with these project partners. So, and let's get some of the sort of key terms straight. So when I say sensitive data, your shoulders, might raise a little bit, your hackles might, go up, your eyebrows might go up, and you might be thinking, yeah, there's a lot of complexity associated with sensitive data. Agreed. And sensitive data is a very vague term, sort of refers to an infinite number of things. So let's get a little bit more specific in terms of the sensitive data that we're talking about in the context of this project. So of course, sensitive data might include things, or your first thoughts might be personal health information, and specifically information defined as PHI under legislation, or personally identifiable information. So it might not be about your health, but it's certainly information that would be considered personal information under the Privacy Act or other provincial, relevant provincial privacy legislation. You might be thinking about research data about human beings. So specifically data subject to the TCPS2, which of course is all research data that involves human beings. But it doesn't just have to be about people in order to be sensitive. So for example, endangered species data is quite often highly sensitive. And there's other types of geographic data and so on that might also be considered highly sensitive that don't have anything to do with human beings specifically. Confidential records. So if you've got the term secondary use coming to mind, you're in the right ballpark. So confidential records, of course, could be anything from employment records, criminal, educational, administrative, Health records, which we talked about earlier in terms of personal health information. When researchers access those types of data for research purposes, that's usually called a secondary use. So those data were collected for some other purpose, to provide you with healthcare, to administer justice, I suppose, in the context of criminal records, and so on. So the data themselves are not collected for research purposes. They're not born as research data, but they become research data, or they're transformed into research data when researchers access them and use them to answer a research question. Often highly sensitive, and of course the terms of use would be closely tied to many things, but that's certainly, whatever conditions were in place when the data were collected, and any strings attached by the organization or the institution or the government that collected them and is responsible for them. And finally, on the screen, I've got embargoed data. So data which may or may not contain sensitivities in and of themselves, but which are sensitive by virtue of contract or agreement. So here in a research context, you might be thinking about partnerships with industry, where portions of the data or the entirety of the data, or sort of data contributed by the industry partner specifically, but not, data collected by the researcher, some portion of the data for that study would be considered sensitive and subject to embargo per some sort of contract or agreement. Now, this is not meant to be exhaustive. I'm sure, you can think of other types of sensitive data that wouldn't fall into any of these categories. But this is just broadly speaking, some of the types of sensitive data that are used in a research context, and that, we might think of first when we're talking about sensitive data. So one really important clarification to make then, in the context of this project, in research generally, when we're talking about sensitive data, we're usually talking about de-identified data. So that's one of the first things from a research ethics perspective you're going to do is if you've got identifiable data or highly sensitive data that contain identifiers like someone's name or their healthcare number, or an email address or a phone number, or even indirect identifiers like, their specific birth date, their marital status, their postal code, things like that. That would be considered highly sensitive. And one of the first things you would do with that data set, of course, is to de-identify it. So you would remove those direct identifiers. Now, there may still, and there almost certainly is, a risk of re-identification. So even if you take my name, Victoria Smith, out of it, if you've got my birth date, my marital status, my postal code, and so on, depending on what other data you have access to, you may be able to determine that that's me, or have a strong suspicion that that's, me or some other, small number of people that you've zeroed in on. And that risk of re-identification is something that, you want to manage really carefully. So depending on what indirect identifiers you have in your data set, ultimately, sort of once you're done your analysis and so on, and you're thinking about depositing those data, you might need to blur or remove some of those identifiers as well. So rather than having someone's exact birth date, you might have a year. Even that might be too identifying. So you might have a range, age 30 to 39, as opposed to, this is their precise age and so on. And this is partly how we manage the risk of re-identification. In the context of this project, the data that we're talking about publishing or ingesting within FRDR or other repositories on a controlled access basis would still be data that have been properly de-identified, where the risk of re-identification is low or very low. So I want to be really clear. We are not at all proposing that FRDR or any other repository ingest wholesale data that contains names or other identifying or highly sensitive information that's subject to legislation like PHI legislation, the Privacy Act or PIPEDA or FIA or whatever, legislation will be relevant in your province. Nothing like that at all. We're talking about de-identified data that have already had a risk of re-identification assessment conducted, and you've confirmed that risk of re-identification is low or very low. Is there the possibility for using some of the technology we'll be talking about to manage higher risk data? Yes, there's a possibility for that, but it's not on the table right now. So as far as this project is concerned, and certainly the project planning that we're engaged in right now, that's out of scope for us. So I hope that context is really clarifying, especially for any sensitive data nerds in the audience that are feeling really skeptical. This is one of the ways in which risk is being managed and mitigated in the context of this project is we're only looking at properly de-identified data. Now, you might still have questions about project scope and what sort of data might be eligible, in the context of this project. I won't read all of this out to you. Certainly, if you've got questions about data, related to any of these research areas or research disciplines, very happy to chat about that in the Q&A. But the one item that I want to really draw your attention to on this screen is the last item listed there, the non-clinical health research data. At this time, we are not entertaining any sort of clinical health information. So if your data comes from an electronic medical record, it comes from a clinical trial, it comes from the secondary use of health information you've accessed, through a research hospital and so on. Sincere apologies, but those data are out of scope at least for now. There's a lot of complexity, a lot of legislation, a lot of regulation attached to clinical health information. But that's not all of the health data that exists. So certainly there's a lot of health information, a lot of health data that's collected that's not clinical, and that's born as research data. So data that is collected through surveys or focus groups, for example, those data are well within scope. So there's some nuance here, and if anybody has questions, would this specific type of data be eligible, or when you say clinical, do you mean this or that? We can chat about that certainly in the Q&A. But just for the purposes of setting context for the project, we want to make clear that we're not talking about clinical health information or information that would be defined as PHI under law. So all that to say, there are three key components to this project. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time now discussing each of these three. So the first is a zero knowledge encryption application that's been purpose built by a development team that's been sort of working on this project for a few years now. It's really slick technology. So there's all kinds of, software, all kinds of ways that you can encrypt, various things, any sort of, data set or package at all. But this is a really cool version that we've built. It's very user friendly, and I'll show you some screenshots and so on in a few minutes. But for now, I just want to indicate that the purpose of the software is to allow you to encrypt your data set and then deposit it within a repository. So the application itself is separate and apart from the repository. You use it as a standalone piece of software. And there's a few things that means. There are a few implications of sort of this model that we've chosen. One is that the software is platform agnostic. So we're building it to work specifically with FRDR, but certainly it can be used with other repositories. And that's a huge, emphasis of this project is creating this tool that is cross-jurisdictional, platform agnostic, that can be adopted and adapted by other repositories and other data stewards and service providers. So the zero knowledge encryption application allows you to encrypt your data set and to generate decryption keys for folks who have requested access and been approved to have access. So this is the controlled access model. So it allows you as a depositor or data steward to manage who has access to that data set and to create decryption keys that are user specific. So I'll go into a little bit of detail about that in a few minutes. This application then allows you to make your data discoverable. So you can deposit an encrypted package within FRDR or another repository using the same workflows, the same infrastructure, the same technology that you would for an open data set. So rather than create an entirely new data repository system or entirely separate workflows and so on, the application allows you to use traditional data repository technology and workflows, but with an encrypted package. So that way you've secured the data, you've ensured that you're maintaining the confidentiality of the data, but you don't need, a brand new repository or an entirely new repository system to support that controlled access model. So this is a sort of clean and slick way, I would say, of sort of leveraging existing open data infrastructure or open data repository infrastructure to support a controlled access model. And then the last thing I'll indicate here is that on this first point is that we've embedded an access request process within the application itself. So this process happens partly in FRDR and then partly within the application. And certainly, any repository looking to adapt their own version of the technology will work with, to support their adoption, their adaptation of it. But essentially, the access request process is all sort of managed through the repository infrastructure and this tool. So a user who discovers a data set by looking at the metadata record and thinks, I could really reuse this data set. I've got an idea for what I could do with these data. They're able to request access to the data set via FRDR, and all of that process, that back and forth, that review, adjudication, approval, data access agreement execution, all of that process is contained within these workflows. So it doesn't need to happen over email. It's not analog. You're not suddenly, on the phone with a contract officer at your institution. All of this takes place, all of that process takes place within the application and within FRDR workflows. So the second component of the project, so that's the technology piece. The second component of the project is a policy framework piece. Now, if you talk to folks in sensitive RDM, I'll say, so like sensitive research data management, often what you'll hear is that the technology is not the issue. Right? There's all kinds of cool technology out there. We can build all kinds of really cool technological solutions. The issue is the regulatory framework, the regulatory environment, the decision makers, the institutional review processes, how this sort of patchwork regulatory system fits together or doesn't fit together to enable sensitive data workflows, particularly as they relate to sharing and long-term repository storage. So, you can have the coolest technology in the world, but if you don't have a policy framework that enables you to use it, you're still stuck at square one. So we're really excited about, testing and deploying this zero knowledge encryption application that we've purpose built for repository environments. But we know that we can't do that successfully. We can't enable researchers to benefit from that technology without also addressing this policy piece. Now, policy framework sounds really ambitious. It sounds like you need your Board of Regents and your Senate involved and so on. We don't think so. Really, the policy framework piece, there's two components to this. And there's the institutional side and the repository side. And on the institution side, it's probably more accurate to describe this as processes and procedures rather than policy. So it's not capital P policy that's sort of immovable and takes many, many years and many hard hours of work to make any sort of change to. It's processes and procedures that generally are more fluid and that I'm not saying it's easy, but it's easier from an institutional perspective to make changes to processes and to procedures. But on the FRDR side and the repository side, we're also creating a policy framework for this controlled access sensitive data service offering. And we want to make sure that the policies that we're designing for the services meet institutions where they're at. So, there's all of these aspects of institutional review and regulatory decision making that are relevant to sensitive data workflows, like ethics review and privacy impact assessments and so on. So we need to make sure that the policy framework we're developing for repositories fits and aligns and connects appropriately with the institutional, policy requirements and process requirements on their side. So in order to make sure that this policy framework is adequate to the technology that we're deploying, sort of suits the regulatory environment, suits the needs of Canadian researchers and research institutions, is informed by and responsive to new and emerging best practices and so on, we've got a full agenda in front of us. And we're going to pursue that agenda by sort of prioritizing and centering a few things. One is that this policy work needs to be collaborative. There's no universe where we can dictate to institutions what sort of changes they should make to their processes, and it would be utterly inappropriate to try. So what we're doing is we're bringing technology to the table, we're bringing some high-level project plans to the table, but really we want institutions to be the decision makers with regard to how implementing and testing this pilot on their campus needs to roll out for them. So if there are implications for ethics review, for privacy impact assessments, for research contracts, and so on, institutions are the ones looking at that and deciding, sort of on their own terms, how they want to engage in that, how they want to take that up. So it needs to be institution-led and driven. It also needs to be cross-jurisdictional. So I mentioned earlier in the context of the regulatory environment, both federal and provincial legislation can be relevant at times to the types of data that we're talking about. One of the issues with sensitive data management in Canada is the regional differences and jurisdictional differences. So you might have a solution that really suits, your institution or your region, but is that solution interoperable? Is it scalable to a pan-Canadian level? Maybe, maybe not. So one of the things that's crucial about this project is that it's absolutely cross-jurisdictional from the start. So in the same way that the tool is platform agnostic and can be adapted and adopted by other repositories, data stewards, and service providers, the policy framework elements that we're designing or that we're collaboratively, helping to design need to be cross-jurisdictional. They need to be pan-Canadian. They need to be functional, between institutions, between regions, between jurisdictions. That means we may need to make some decisions about scope. So there might be some use cases where, the jurisdictional differences can't be overcome, or at least can't be overcome in the next 2 to 5 years, and fair enough. But we're looking to build a system that can support whatever it is that we can support, and however many data types and research disciplines and research areas we're able to support. So third element now, so you've got cool technology, let's say, and let's say you've now collaboratively developed a policy framework environment that supports the use of that technology. But if people don't know about it, they don't know how to use it, they aren't confident making decisions, navigating it, you're kind of still stuck at square one. So the third element of this project are the training and education resources needed to support users engaging with these tools and with this policy framework. So this is where we'll be supporting institutions with rolling out training and education initiatives for various folks. So not just for researchers, but for support staff, for decision makers, for regulators. I'm often hearing, if only our ethics board, had an RDM person on it, or if only, the RDM staff are desperate to get insight into, some of these research ethics processes and so on. So this is where we're all touching a different piece of the elephant. And we want to get a bird's eye view and provide everybody with access to training and resources that puts us on the same page. So basic things like vocabulary. When we say de-identified, at a privacy office or in a research ethics office, that might mean something a little bit different to the contracts folks or to the IT folks. The word anonymized does not necessarily have an agreed upon definition, depending on who you ask or where you ask. So these are some of the issues that researchers can encounter. And some of the areas where we can sort of see friction happen with developing research contracts or sort of processes on campus. So getting everybody roughly on the same page with a shared understanding of the current best practices, sort of the current key concepts involved in sensitive research data management. It's really about capacity and community building. So there are existing resources to support this effort. There are gaps in resources that need to be filled. So this third component is about beta testing, training and education content with participating institutions and researchers, ultimately refining and honing that content so it can be released nationally. So that was a lot of information. I'm going to now tell you a little bit about the project progress to date. A great deal of technical development has already been completed. So the technology essentially has been built, and we're hard and fast at work at policy framework and partnership development. So as I mentioned earlier, collaboration with researchers and institutions is a crucial part of this project. And so we've been sort of quietly working on partnership development for some time now. And all of this, of course, is gearing toward a pilot project. So this diagram is to show you what the zero knowledge encryption model means in the context of this project. So at the top of the screen, you'll see FRDR, the Federated Research Data Repository that I mentioned earlier. And hopefully what you'll see here is that the original data set, the sensitive data set, is encrypted locally using the encryption application. And FRDR itself never interacts with, never touches, or has any insight into that original data set. So you as a researcher, you would use this encryption technology in whatever environment you're already storing those data. So of course, there might be, various regulations on your campus that determine where you're allowed to access and analyze and work on during the active phase of your project, sensitive data. And of course, one of the risk points to sensitive data management is transferring data from one environment to another. So you don't need to do that here. Instead, you would simply use the encryption technology in the environment where you've already stored the data. So you're not transferring them to a new environment. They're encrypted locally in the existing environment, and it's only that encrypted package which is then transferred and moved. So that encrypted package is deposited within FRDR using traditional workflows. So the normal data deposit, data ingestion process, which involves curation for us. And we're modifying that slightly for the sensitive data use case, but ultimately the workflows largely remain the same. The other thing I want to draw your attention to with this diagram is HashiCorp Vault, which is the secret key management service that we're using in this project. And what's crucial here is that the encryption key is stored within Vault, not within FRDR. So in the same way, from a research ethics perspective, if I'm looking at an application, I would expect the researcher to tell me that they're storing their study key and their study data separately. So if there's a breach and somebody accesses the study data, they don't know who participants 1, 2, 3, and 4 are. And similarly, if the study key is accessed and they discover that participant 1 is Victoria Smith, that person wouldn't have access to the study data. Those are stored entirely separately. So they wouldn't know what participant 1, Victoria Smith's answers are to the survey questions, for example. So in that same way, the encrypted package that's stored within FRDR is never stored alongside or anywhere near the encryption key. So this is what we mean by zero knowledge encryption, is the service provider up here has no knowledge of the contents of the encrypted package and no means of decrypting it. So we don't have access to the keys. So here I've got some screenshots from the software for you. Now this is, we haven't done a lot of user testing yet, so we'll make all of this very pretty. But right now, what's important is that it's totally functional. And what I want to show you with this screenshot is really how user-friendly the software is. So you might be wondering, well, Victoria, if encryption is this easy way of, helping to manage sensitive research data, why isn't everybody already doing that? And that's a great question. And if you're familiar with the TCPS2, you might say, well, geez, Victoria, the federal research ethics policy actually recommends and requires that encryption be used to manage sensitive research data. So this isn't a new idea, and that's absolutely correct. But there are no broadly agreed upon encryption technologies endorsed by or supported in this context. So if you're an entrepreneurial researcher and you're like, I totally know how to do this myself, I can manage it on my own, that's great. But most researchers wouldn't describe themselves that way. If you say, please encrypt your data, a lot of researchers are going to Google, how do I encrypt data? And if they don't have clear guidance or instructions on how to do that, they're probably not going to feel very confident navigating that. They might have questions. How do I do this and make sure I'm complying with the TCPS2, with my grant agreement, with my institutional requirements? Is there privacy law that's relevant here? And if the researcher asks those questions, they might get different answers depending on which department they go to on campus, whether they're asking their privacy office or their ethics board or their IT support and so on. So it's that lack of clarity, that lack of guidance, and that lack of resources to support researchers that's the issue. It's not, is encryption viable or are there means of encrypting things? It's how can I use encryption technology and know confidently that I'm complying with my obligations, especially if I'm a researcher that's not necessarily all that tech savvy. It's one thing if you're a computer scientist and you do everything, on Linux or whatever, cool. But a lot of researchers are not necessarily going to fall into that camp. And so, if you're working in digital humanities, you're a health researcher, you might not spend a lot of your time using Python, or you might not, feel all that confident navigating different types of technology. But if you can use Facebook and you can use your email, you can use this software, and that's crucial. So it is extremely user-friendly. And it's meant to be accessible to a broad range of users, regardless of their skill level. So even, sort of senior career researchers that often depend on grad students to help them, with their various accounts and so on. This is for you guys. We promise we've made this as simple and easy as possible. So it really is as easy as it looks. You select the data set here, you click this button, you choose the data set that you've got in your local environment that you want to encrypt. You choose an output location. It's only going to be there for a few minutes before you deposit it. So it's sort of, you can just choose your desktop and you hit the big encrypt button. And that's it. A few seconds later, a window pops up and says your data set's been encrypted, and there the encrypted package sits in whatever location you decided to put it. And then you're free to proceed with the normal deposit workflow using that encrypted package. So what I've got here now is a FRDR dataset landing page. So normally, if you go on FRDR and you bring up a data set, what you'll find is here in this section, there's a whole bunch of files that you can just click directly and have immediate access to the data. Because of course, right now on FRDR, all of our data are open data, publicly available. But this is a dummy page that we've set up to show you what a sensitive data listing would look like. And again, we'll pretty it up a little bit, but the point is, you can't access the data files directly, and you're indicated, or there's an indication that the data set itself is sensitive, and you need to follow instructions in order to request access. So let's say you click this button, you're brought here. Now, this is a access request process that we've built. When we're testing this with researchers, with institutions, we have no doubt that there will be all kinds of iterative development, and we might create various different models for access. So for example, there might be data sets that are low risk enough that you don't need to complete a full request. Maybe by virtue of being, a tenured researcher in good standing with your institution, maybe that's enough to justify your access to really low risk data. That's not up for us to decide. That's something to collaboratively figure out with participating researchers, institutions, regulators, and experts. But what we've done here is we've built an access request process that mirrors what you would typically see in a health data access request environment, where there's usually a pretty high bar, to gain access to data. But researchers who are familiar with filling out those data access request forms are thinking, yeah, another 40-page document I've got to handle, eek, don't want to deal with that. Huge burden. Agreed, hate that as well. But if you're familiar with those documents, if you've pored over enough data access request forms, you might come to the same conclusion that I have, which is that pretty much all of the information being solicited in those forms is already going to be contained within a DMP, a research protocol, and a couple of other key documents. So rather than create a form where researchers, once again are answering the same old questions over and over again, we're asking for those documents instead. So you need to include a copy of your CV. Do you have the appropriate background to undertake the research you're proposing? Because of my professional situation, I could probably write a really compelling access request for pediatric oncology data. Nobody should give me access to that. I'm bad at math and I'm not an oncologist. So it's important that you actually have the appropriate background to undertake the research you've proposed. Next, your proposal or your protocol. If we give you these data, what are you going to do with them and why? Next, your ethics clearance or exemption. So, what have you told your REB? Do you need REB approval? Are the appropriate checks and balances from the institutional perspective in place? And then lastly, your DMP. So this is the document that the researcher might not already have or might not be responsible for creating. DMPs are increasingly expected by certain funding organizations. So if you're familiar with the new Tri-Council RDM policy, they're now requiring DMPs with some funding opportunities. It is a best practice. Certainly it's something, everybody ought to be doing, but we all ought to floss, every single day and so on. I don't do it every single day. So we know researchers aren't always creating DMPs. That being said, we operate DMP Assistant, a handy tool to help you create a DMP. And there's all kinds of different templates within DMP Assistant. So we're purpose building a template within DMP Assistant for this use case. So the secondary use of existing sensitive research data accessed through a public repository, for research purposes. So that at minimum makes creating the DMP as streamlined and straightforward as possible. So no extraneous or irrelevant questions. One of the neat tricks about this page is that with the exception of the CV, all of these documents are performing two jobs. So first of all, they're the application you submit and the basis upon which your access request will be adjudicated. But once your access request is approved, these documents are auto-generated into the appendices that accompany the data access agreement. So your proposal or your protocol becomes your approved use of data. The landing page describing the data and its in question, the metadata becomes an appendix indicating which data set, this data access agreement is referring to. Your DMP becomes your commitments for how you'll manage the local copy of the data once you receive it. So, where will you store it? Who will have access and so on. So that sort of, again, simplifies things from an administrative perspective. Another key issue here, though, is that rarely, if ever, is a data access request approved on first submission. And if you've got experience here, you're like, yeah, Victoria, first submission, try 7th or 8th. I know, it can be a pain. So what we've done is sort of built a system within these workflows to allow for the requester and the depositor to have a back and forth. So the depositor might say, hey, your research sounds cool. I'd love to approve your access, but you need to make a couple of changes in your DMP. in terms of who has access or where you're storing it locally and so on. Or, hey, we need to see some additional detail in your protocol around, A, B, and C. And so the requester can then modify those documents, make those changes, resubmit. And what's really crucial from our perspective is that all of that provenance is captured fully. So versioning those documents, precisely what was asked for and exactly on what basis was access approved is preserved within the system. So if there's ever a question, months or years down the road, why was this approved? Which version was approved? Why was this change requested and so on? That's all captured within the system because we know that that's very important. So that's the embedded access request process. So that's a lot of information on the technology piece. I'm now going to switch over to the policy and institutional collaboration piece. There are two key phases to our collaboration with researchers and their institutions. First is a project roadmap that we'll be co-developing with a cohort of participating research organizations. So that project roadmap essentially is a very detailed project implementation plan. We have high-level plans and expectations for what pilot testing this technology is going to look like and the sorts of workflows and innovations and policy framework development that's going to be needed to support it. But again, we don't want to prescribe that to institutions. So we're bringing that to the table and offering it up to them to say, what do you think? And what do you need? And what are you hoping to get out of this? So do you have specific strategic objectives as an institution that you'd like to embed within your participation in this project? Are there local needs? Are there specific research groups at your institution that have, a gap that they're looking to have addressed? Are there resources that you think your campus is lacking that would be needed to support your medium and long-term engagement with this project and so on? All of that needs to get spelled out in detail, and then we take responsibility for supporting it as best we can. So what we'll do is be working with these institutions to create a detailed project roadmap where they have the opportunity to embed specific strategic objectives or goals or local needs or specific initiatives that they might be leading or interested in sort of taking a leadership role in, and putting that directly within the project roadmap. So this is a co-developed collaborative project plan that reflects ecosystem needs and the perspectives and the requirements of institutions from various jurisdictions across the country. So it's ambitious to get everybody at the table and to develop consensus on these things, but that's step one. And then step two, of course, is implementing that project plan. And the collaboration continues, of course. It's not just, tell us what you think we should do and then we're going to do it. Tell us what you think we should all do together and then let's all do it together. So once we've got this project roadmap and we're implementing it, we'll be piloting the project and supporting national working groups with the participating researchers and institutions. So I'm going to say a little bit more now about this phase two, these national working groups. So this is subject to change based on the outcome of this project roadmap development piece. So this is what we've suggested as 6 major categories that merit their own national working groups. Now, once we're doing project roadmap development, institutions might say, we can collapse a couple of these into one group, or actually there are some categories that are missing. We'll need some additional groups. Fantastic. We're really looking forward to those contributions, that feedback. So again, this is a draft that will be subject to change, but what we anticipate, what sort of high level expectations we have are that we'll need to support working groups in these areas: research ethics, privacy, contract, IT, research support, and governance. And so I'll say a little bit about, who we would hope would populate these groups. Of course, it will be up to the institutions participating, but research ethics, of course, is going to be, the research ethics office. And really what we're hoping for is that participation will come with folks who are in a decision-making capacity or sort of directly making recommendations to decision makers. So if you're a really large institution, you've got a lot of staff in your ethics office, please don't, it might not be very efficient or beneficial to send junior ethics officer number 4, when really what you need is your director or your manager at the table who's empowered to make decisions or make recommendations. And so 2 of the key pieces that the research ethics group will be looking at will be ethics application forms and consent form templates. Privacy, of course, your privacy office. We want to talk privacy impact assessment processes. Different institutions approach privacy impact assessments in a research context very differently. They're responding to different legislation. So we think this merits its own working group. Research contracts are a huge piece of this puzzle. So I've already talked a little bit about the data access agreement that's involved. So the research contracts unit has a fair bit of heavy lifting to do in this project. IT. There's all kinds of IT implications for how the software is being used locally, regulations that institutions might want to set on, are you using a VPN, or can you only use these services on campus assets, and so on. Research support. So, libraries are the lifeblood of institutions in a major way. We want to make sure that the folks who provide crucial research support, especially within libraries, but also within other units, support units, are informed and on board and have all of the opportunity to, to participate actively in this work, and to be able to support researchers engaging with it. And then finally, governance. So I mentioned earlier that there are implications for certain campus processes like ethics review and so on. And given that we want to make sure that those institutional processes align properly with our repository policy requirements and processes and so on, this governance piece is what enables that to happen. So there are three key elements of the policy framework that we're proposing that will be developed in collaboration with these national working groups who are populated by the staff of the participating institutions. So first is this data access agreement template. Every institution has one. They negotiate them with one another all day long. And I used to wear this hat for institution. And so I know that these documents are not necessarily up to date. So I'll give you an example. Let's say I'm drafting a data access agreement, to share with another institution. A colleague might say, oh, is that going to, to St. FX? You might want to remove paragraph 7 because they always ask that we remove paragraph 7. I'll sort of say, okay, well, what does paragraph 7 do? If I can just remove it every time St. FX asks me to, what purpose is it serving? They're like, oh, well, you'd have to ask Brenda. Who's Brenda? Well, she retired 8 years ago. Okay, so I don't know ultimately, why this clause is in our template, what purpose it's serving. Maybe it was needed under some previous version of the Privacy Act, which has now been updated twice. Who knows? So the data access agreement template piece is something institutions have been pretty excited about, and it's an opportunity to harmonize. So this will allow us to zero in on these differences between templates, between institutions, and say, in what cases are these differences sort of superficial? They're something that actually, if we dig into a little bit, we could eliminate these differences and establish some common ground. And where are these differences fundamental? Where do they reflect jurisdictional differences or sort of, strong institutional requirements where there's something, that we can't get over there? And then what are the implications? So that might mean that certain data types or certain use cases will be excluded from our initial service offering. That's fine. We will never develop a data access agreement template that services or accommodates all instances of sensitive research data. That is a pipe dream. But if we can create an agreement template that accommodates the bulk of straightforward cases, that is an incredible opportunity to de-burden currently used institutional resources. So if you've got someone who has to manually draft and negotiate that contract every single time, and you can take 40% of that person's workload off their desk, that's an incredible proposition. And I know, from working in contract offices, you're often working sort of 70-hour weeks. It's a busy department. So whatever we can do to help de-burden the resources of those units, I know is very welcome. So this data access agreement template will be developed iteratively over the course of the pilot in collaboration with institutions. Second is this governance agreement. So I've been mentioning throughout, ethics review, privacy impact assessments, contract review, and so on. We need a governance agreement that outlines precisely what the institutional obligations are and what our obligations are as a service provider. So for example, you're going to conduct ethics review. We're going to make sure that ethics review is conducted and the appropriate approval is in place. And then how does that happen actually? What are the processes and the mechanisms by which those connections are made? So this governance agreement is crucial to allow us to connect and align those internal processes. And then the last element of the policy framework is tweaks to internal processes. And that sounds really boring. And maybe for most people it is. But it's honestly, I think, where the magic happens. So let's look at ethics applications, for example. Pretty much every ethics application in the country asks, do you plan on sharing your data, yes or no? If yes, say more. In my experience, 99% of the time, researchers say no. Because if they say yes, they get 30 follow-up questions and a 6-month delay on their approval. And it's never actually clear what purpose that serves. And that question's pretty vague and sort of poorly formed. It really doesn't get at the heart of the issue. And a researcher filling out an ethics application, they just want to start collecting the data. They're not thinking about what they're going to do with it 4 years out once they've got it and they've analyzed it and they've published it. They're not thinking in those terms yet, by and large. And anything that delays data collection is a problem. So they're going to say no because they're smart. But that's an issue, because then they come to me 4 years later and they say, I've got this really cool data I want to deposit, and I'd love to take it, but I can't, because your ethics approval states that you're never ever going to share these data with anyone and that you promised to destroy them within 5 years of completing your study. So we're stuck. And now we need you to go and get an amendment. And so you're going to amend your ethics application form, and the Research Ethics Board is going to say, well, your consent form, made all of these commitments that you weren't going to share your data and so on. So it's, are we going to grant you a waiver of consent? We're in the weeds already. And we've, invested a fair bit of resources to undo decisions and commitments that the researcher made in good faith and for good reasons earlier in their project. So how do we prevent that from being the situation we all find ourselves in? We need to create the conditions to support researchers with declaring data sharing intentions earlier in the project and not have that interfere or delay their project in any meaningful way. So 2 things need to happen in this specific case. The ethics application form needs to be revised to ask more specifically about data deposit. So the question might be, do you plan on depositing your data in a public repository such as FRDR? And would it be open access or controlled access and so on? The research, or I guess, 3 things. So the question needs to exist in a more precise form. The researcher needs to have appropriate training and support to understand that question and its implications. But third, and I think most important of all, actually, the researcher needs to believe that answering that question yes is not going to delay their approval or produce 30 follow-up questions from the REB. So the REB needs to be on board. They need to have buy-in. They need to be trained and up to date on current repository practices. So when they see that question answered yes, as long as the other boxes are ticked appropriately, they just move on. There's no delay. There's no follow-up interrogation. So all of that is pretty complex. And it requires, amending certain processes and workflows and forms. So consent form templates need to have appropriate data sharing language in place, and so on and so forth. And there's internal processes here for each of those groups I was talking about earlier. So it's not just ethics, it's also privacy, it's also contracts, it's IT, it's everybody. And so we need to take this approach. It's going to be, a lot of elbow grease, a lot of hard work. But if we do this properly, we create a pipeline from the stage where a researcher is beginning a new project, they're applying for funding, all the way from the grant application stage through to publication and deposit in a repository. Every touch point with the institution, every institutional or regulatory review needs to have this contemporary data sharing lens applied so that the forms, the documentation, the processes are reflective of best practices and enable researchers to follow best practices. So rather than having ethics forms that just presume that all of your data will always be destroyed, maybe data sharing is becoming the new default. And so the forms themselves will lend, will sort of lead the researcher down that path instead. So it's easy to say, yes, of course, I'm going to preserve my data. And yes, of course, I'm going to use these resources to de-identify them. And yes, of course, they're going to be shared on a controlled access model in these ways. And I can simply choose a consent form template, that's appropriate to that, and so on. And not make data sharing an exercise of undoing commitments and introducing amendments and so on. So again, highly ambitious, but working closely with partners that are committed to this project, we think all of this is quite in scope and doable. I know, famous last words, right? But no, we've got a lot of support, a lot of ambition, and we know that institutions and researchers are looking to support us with this. So we're excited to engage in this ambitious project with them. So here are some of the questions that we've been asking institutions. Do your researchers collect and use sensitive data? Do they want better tools and services to support access and sharing? And do you as an institution want a clear, compliant, and up-to-date pipeline to support your researchers with sensitive data management? And if the answers to those questions are yes, we invite you to consider joining our cohort of institutions participating in this pilot project. So I imagine everyone on this call might have a slightly different, potential role that they would play in a project like this if their institution is involved. reach out to your institution, reach out to us, find out if your institution's already planning to participate, and if not, if they might be interested, and let's chat about different ways that you might take up a role within this project. So certainly we are excited about how institutions are carving out their own areas of interest. Some groups are saying, well, we innovated ethics forms years ago. And maybe that's something that can be scaled, that other institutions want to adapt. Or, hey, we created this really cool sort of streamlined institutional review process that combines, privacy and research contract and ethics. Phenomenal. Is that something that we can scale and invite other institutions to adapt? So there are all kinds of ways that institutions and research groups and organizations can carve out areas of interest and focus for themselves within this project. So, the sky's the limit, I think. There's so much opportunity ahead of us in terms of where we're going to take this technology and this collaborative framework to support institutions and researchers with innovating these workflows. So, thank you very much. I know I've thrown a ton of information at you. You probably have a million questions, and maybe you're still feeling super skeptical. I don't blame you at all. So, very much looking forward to your questions. Please don't hesitate to share them either now or on Slack or offline by email after the fact. Thank you very much.